okay, and it's 5:10. We may start, and before starting, please let me thank Professor Standing and Professor Huws to accept and to be here today with you. As you know, this is a seminar organized by the Horizon 2020 Project Plus, Platform Labor in Urban Spaces. It's a project started now from almost 2 years, that it's inquiring the impact of some main disruptive platforms as Airbnb, Deliveroo, Helpling, and Uber on 7 European cities. The idea is to inquire how effectively these platforms are changing the working conditions and the urban life across Europe. Our idea today is to start a common discussion on a specific topic investigated in the project. That means the welfare. And we will do this thanks to the support of Professor Huws, that recently edited a new book that is Reinventing the Welfare State, Digital Platform and Public Policies. Professor Huws, that is one of the partners of the project with the team of the University of Hertfordshire. And we will do this discussion thanks also to Professor Standing, author of Battling Eight Giants, Basic Income Now. Professor Standing, that is one of the advisors of our project, and a project that is also interested in a possibility to, the option of the basic income as a new welfare tool, especially for platform workers too. And the project is also interested in how, these digital platforms take profit, and we may regulate them also in terms of shared benefits. And this idea also of to share, the income, the profits, thanks to a basic income. So I would thank again Professor Huws and Professor Standing to be with us today to help us to trigger, this other important topic of the project, that is the welfare. And I give the floor to Professor Mezzadra, that is the project leader of Plus, and will introduce today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Maurilio. And I would also like to thank Ursula Huws and Standing, as well as all the participants in this book launch. Our topic is welfare. And there is a need to say that welfare is a hot topic in the current conjuncture. The pandemic has shed light in a catastrophic way on the inadequacy of public health systems that have been disrupted and reorganized according to neoliberal logics over the last decades. In a way, we can also say that the catastrophe of welfare systems in the face of the pandemic provides us with an opportunity to rethink welfare, to reinvent welfare, to quote the title of Ursula's book. And I would like to to emphasize the verb reinvent. What is needed today is not a return to the welfare state of the 20th century, whose material foundations have disappeared and whose disciplinary character has been criticized by social movements and struggles in the 1960s and 70s, in particular by second wave feminism, long before the neoliberal counter-revolution. I think this is a first very important point in Ursula's book. She convincingly makes clear that what is at stake today is not a return, but a reinvention of the welfare state. Ursula's book deals with several crucial topics, and I will not expand on each of those topics. I will limit myself to mention 3 of them, which are particularly relevant also for our research project, the PLUS project, Platform Labor in Urban Spaces. The first important point I would like to quickly discuss is the strict link between the welfare state and the labor market. This is Ursula's point of departure, and I find it important both regarding the content and regarding the method. At the very beginning of the book, Ursula very effectively describes the erosion of the standard employment contract that was the basis of the welfare state in the time of mass industrialization, in the time of Fordism. And this erosion of the standard employment contract is discussed by Ursula from the angle of the emergence of digital labor and platform labor. We all know that Ursula was a kind of pioneer in the field of digital labor studies. In this book, her emphasis is in particular on platform labor. And even beyond the statistical relevance of platform labor, Ursula singles out a general trend, speaking of a general platformization of labor. And this implies a need to analyze platform labor with a kind of double gaze, focusing on the one hand on platform workers in the literal sense, and on the spillover effects of the platform business model for labor in general, on the transformations connected with the emergence of platform labor for workers that do not work for digital platforms. This is again a very important point, even from a methodological point of view. The second point that I would like to mention and shortly discuss has to do with labor struggles within and against the general trend toward the platformization of labor. Sure, we need to work toward a new universal charter of rights, and Ursula's book provides us with many important ideas and hints in this direction. But we know that even historically, labor rights have never been the outcome of the work of legal scholars and policymakers. They were rather imposed by labor struggles. And this is a very important point also regarding the history of the welfare state in the 20th century. Just think of the important role played by mass workers' struggles in the 1930s during Roosevelt's New Deal. So what about today? I think that in her book, Ursula effectively raises this question, focusing in particular on self-organization and struggles of food delivery riders. She warns against romanticizing them as a new vanguard among the precarious workers, but she also emphasizes the relevance of their efforts and movements. And I think there is a need to further discuss this question in the context of the pandemic, taking stock on the one hand of the changes in the composition and working conditions of riders, and on the other hand of the stubbornness and continuity of their struggles. Just think of the first global strike of riders on October 8th. The third and last point regards the challenging chapter, the thought-provoking chapter, dedicated by Ursula in a book to the role digital platforms can play in the reinvention of the welfare state. Repurposing platform technologies for public good, starting locally as Ursula has it, is an ambitious task that implies a huge amount of political, economic, social, and even technological inventiveness. Ursula provides readers with compelling examples regarding the potential use of public and community platforms in transport services, in care services, and food services. More generally, I think This is a question that deserves further discussion in the framework of current processes and projects of digitalization of public administration. What Ursula's book enables us to imagine is a digital politics from below, which may be considered part of a more general attempt to forge a counter logistics and in a way also new institutions of welfare. There is much more to be discussed in Ursula's book. I just focused on these 3 points because they seem to me to be particularly interesting in themselves, but also with respect to the PLUS project. I hand it over to Ursula, and I thank her again for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Sandro, for that incredibly generous, almost embarrassingly generous introduction. And hello, everybody, on this, in London anyway, very depressing, rainy December afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I want to start by making a point. It is a point that matters a lot to me, but I think it cannot be emphasized enough right now, which is that this particular book was written very specifically in a British context for a British audience, and it was written last year when we had a very important and very important general election with a very depressing outcome. And the point that I want to make is that it actually can be, although there are commonalities, there are enormous commonalities, it's very, very dangerous to extrapolate from one national context to another. And I think there are 2 sets of reasons for this. The first set of reasons is a scientific one. It's the fact that capitalist development around the world has been incredibly uneven, and a technological development or economic development can have one impact in one place and a completely different impact in another place. And in the case of the online platforms particularly, I think we need to take account of 3 very different kinds of national and regional settings. And the first, which is probably the majority over the world, certainly in large parts of Africa and South America and South Asia and so on, are economies where capitalism has not actually developed that far, where an awful lot of social reproduction is still taking place outside the scope of capitalism. So in other words, what's going on is that the sort of basic capitalist process of commodification, a sort of first time round commodification, if you like. And, you know, for a lot of platform workers in some parts of the world, their first encounter with a platform work is also their first encounter with being paid other than in cash. It's their first encounter with finding work other than through word of mouth. It's a completely different context from the context to which platform workers in some other parts of the world arrive at it. It's a different experience. And a second category, I'm being very broad here to save time, a second category are the developed economies, which in the 20th century, in response to the sort of workers' struggles that Sandro was talking about, and social democratic movements, especially, but not entirely during the post-war period, managed to achieve a very high level of decommodification. In other words, social democratic societies clawed back from capitalism a lot of the characteristics of commodities that attach to goods and services. And you know, the most obvious examples are the Nordic countries, you know, where you've got public health services, public education, strong labour codes giving workers very strong, or at least male indigenous workers, very strong labour rights, protections for trade unions are incorporated into national institutions and so on. So you've got the first stage commodification going on in some parts of the world. You've got some parts of the world which still have this 20th century decommodified character. And then you have other parts of the world, the UK being a prime example, where there's a very advanced process of recommodification, where under neoliberalism, that decommodification that took place in the 20th century is being stripped away. So the introduction in countries, more developed countries, the advent of online platforms is, if you like, it's a casualization of jobs that were previously protected. And that's very different from a context in which it's the first entry into the formal economy for workers who were previously in the informal economy. We have differences even in different parts of Europe and Italy, even in different parts of the same country, in the degree of formalization and informalization. So that's a good scientific reason to be wary of taking a model from one country and plonking it down in another one and assuming it will have the same effect. The second set of reasons for being wary of looking for sort of top-down, one-size-fits-all solutions is a political one, as Sandra says. It's very important that any welfare solutions are democratically, if you like, owned and co-constructed with local working classes. And we've all seen, I mean, over the neoliberal years especially, the way in which, you know, representatives of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or consultancies went around the world trying to impose standard economic models of privatization or outsourcing or whatever it is. In the 1990s, in particular, the McKinsey Global Institute went around the world trying to sell a particular model of tax credit system as a way of, as a sort of form of welfare model with awful consequences in some countries. So these are like sort of the snake oil salesman, you know, who went around the United States in the 19th century selling these remedies that were going to cure everything. I think we have to, there's a real risk right now that there is a kind of left version of these snake oil salesmen growing up, going around thinking that universal basic income is a kind of, or for instance, or a particular kind of workers' rights, or a particular model of tax system, or whatever it is, that it's kind of magic bullet that will work the same everywhere. And I think we have to be very, very cautious about that, and look always at the local context and work from the bottom up, and not look for these instant top-down solutions. I could give you innumerable examples of cases where this attempt to transplant from one a policy from one context to another has been a disaster, but I could go on all afternoon and I won't bore you with that. So anyway, with that big proviso, I'd like to, I was going to show you some slides, but it's telling me that the host has disabled participants' screen sharing. I wonder if the host might be kind enough to sort that out. Anyway, what I want to do is to talk now about the origins of this particular book. Should I try again? Is it working?
Ursula, I tried to allow you to share your screen. Maybe you
right.
try.
It seems to be showing me somebody else's screen and not my own, but I'll try again. Share screen. Ah, here we go. Is that working?
Looks like it.
Yeah.
I can't see it, but if you can see it, then that's what matters. That's what matters. So very quickly, this book, it draws basically on two sources. One is I've done a lot of theoretical work over the years, but my most recent book is Labour in Contemporary Capitalism, and it borrows some conceptual framings from that. But more importantly, it draws on some empirical work that I did along with my colleague Neil Spencer, who I think is with us today, who did the lion's share of the work on this, my colleague from the University of Hertfordshire. This a study of the platformization of work in Europe, where we did surveys in 13 European countries. And the results were really quite startling in some ways. Whoops. Right, can you see? Oh, here we go. And I'm not going to show you lots and lots of graphs or anything, but I'm just going to show you two quite striking slides that illustrate the enormous scale of what we found. The first was the very widespread use of digital apps to manage a just-in-time workforce, which extend way beyond the platform workers to the labour market in general. As you can see, the blue bits on that platform are people who say they work for online platforms at least once a week, and the orange ones in the middle are the people who occasionally work for online platforms, and the huge grey bit on the right is people who do not work for platforms, who nevertheless have to use an app to be told when there's a task waiting for them or to record their hours. And in the UK, we were lucky enough to be able to run the survey twice. We ran it in 2016 and in 2019, and we were able to see this absolutely phenomenal growth over just the 3-year period. That is just the 3 years leading up to the pandemic. Of course, a lot of these things would have grown exponentially since the pandemic, but we don't have statistics on that. So as you can see, that there was a more than doubling of this kind of working by digital app in that very short 3-year period in the UK. And I now want to show you another slide, which is a bit more specific. And this is looking at the supply and demand for household services using digital platforms. Again, we have this time series in the UK. And again, we see that this has more than doubled. The supply has more than doubled, and the demand has really very significantly increased during this 3-year period. So what's been going on here? Why are people suddenly needing to use online platforms to get basic household services done? This is things like cleaning and care work, and getting your garden fixed and walking your dog, and this is basic household services. And it seems to me that this can only be explained in a larger context. We have to look at what has happened to not just to European labour markets, but to social reproduction in Europe since the financial crisis. The financial crisis, of course, as we all know, it brought about this enormous restructuring of capital. There was a huge concentration of capital. There was a huge, as there always is, if you go back through history, as there always is after a major crisis in capitalism, it's in the aftermath of the crisis that companies invest in new technologies, because they need to use them. People don't just use technologies because they're there. They use them for specific purposes. And the two main specific purposes are, first, to get a lot more productivity out of the existing labour force and to cheapen the value of labour. And the second use is to actually generate new businesses with new business models. And if you like, new fields of accumulation through new kinds of commodification, if you want to be technical about it. And so the financial crisis, in this view, wasn't just a crisis for capital. It was also, for the working class, a crisis of social reproduction. During the period before the financial crisis, up until 2007, 2008, wages were going down in real terms, you know, right across Europe and in many other parts of the world. But this was kind of disguised. It was partly disguised because the cost of goods was going down, because all these cheap imports from China and so on meant that people could buy more for that money. But it was also going down because there was credit was being chucked at people like there was no tomorrow. So if you couldn't afford a pair of shoes for your kids, you put it on the credit card, you know. And suddenly, after the financial crisis, that source of credit was cut off. And simultaneously with austerity policies being brought in that reduced the amount of care and support, social reproduction support that was available from the state in Europe massively, and in a context where you had an aging population as well. So you've got the demands for household labour massively increasing, and basically no time to do it in a situation where, unlike in the 20th century, where most households in Europe are two-earner households, where you have both men and women working. So there was no, so there's huge time squeeze on households, you could say. And that led to the pattern. I just want to show you one more thing about this slide before I move on to the next one. As you can see, the blue bars on this line are the people doing, working for platforms, providing household services at least once a week. And the orange bars are the people who use the household services. The grey bar at the bottom is people doing both. And as you can see, it's almost as high as the people working for the platforms. And when we looked in some detail, it's around, it varies a bit from country to country, but around at least 85% of the people who work for online platforms are also users of them. So we can't see this development as like a new kind of servant class providing services for a privileged bourgeoisie, you know, as one might have seen servants in the past. This is an exchange of services going on within the working class. And the way that I explain this is that what was created during that period is what I call the vicious cycle of platform work. You have workers who desperately need extra income because their wages have gone down in real terms and their expenses are going up. And in order to get this extra income, they work longer hours. Most of the evidence we have from the surveys is that the vast majority, of over 90% of platform workers, are doing it on top of another job, on top of another source of income. So people take on extra work on top of their existing work. So they're working longer and longer hours, which gives them less time for housework. And so because they literally don't have time to do it, or too exhausted to do it, that pushes a drive to purchase household services in the market. And increasingly, those household services are provided by online platforms. And so this drives a growth in online platforms, which in turn drives a growth in low-paid and precarious work. Those workers need an extra income. And so round and round we go, this Ouroboros, if you like, the snake that eats its own tail. And this seems to me to be the crisis of social reproduction. that we're in right now. So any reinvention of the welfare state has to address, this is what has to be addressed. We have to find a way to break this cycle. And that involves interventions both in the labour market and in the field of social reproduction, as Sandro was saying earlier. So this is the challenge. So I'm just going to quickly sum up some of the ways forward that I see, but reminding you that this is in the UK context, and these solutions might very well not work in another context. So we have to always, the path dependencies are always there, and don't forget them. So first of all, we clearly need a reform of the tax benefit system. And here we certainly need a basic income, a universal basic income of some form. The benefit system we've got in the UK is absolutely awful. It's because as a result of these tax credit model, this tax credit model that was introduced actually by a Labour government initially in the 1990s, we have a system whereby workers are forced into low-paid jobs that pay less than the value of subsistence, with the state picking up. So you can't claim benefit. You're forced to take any kind of work in order to get the benefit. You then get a low wage, and the state then tops up that wage to a sort of livable level. And that top up, first it means that there's no point for workers to actually go out on strike for higher wages, because whatever extra wage they get, then the benefit just drops. So there's a disincentive to take industrial action because the level, the maximum income stays the same. They just get less benefit and more wage, and it acts as a subsidy. It acts as a subsidy to employers who pay very, very low wages. And it's but combined in a context where there's the incredible discipline is exerted on the unemployed by a very penal and horrible outsourced management system. So anyway, so we definitely need it, but in the UK context, thinking about some of the points I made earlier about the different models of social reproductions in different contexts, it is very important that it's combined with universal public services. If you try and bring it in a context where universal public services continue to decline, you end up you could end up with a situation where the government thinks, oh, it's okay to dismantle the health service. We give people money and then they can buy their health in the private market. They can buy health services, or they can buy education, or whatever it is. And this is not only contributes to more inequalities, but it changes the character of the public services. It reduces their universality, but it also leads to, of course, much poorer working conditions for workers in those public services. In my view, it also needs to be combined with a high minimum wage. Because if you don't have a high minimum wage, then you just replicate the problem I just described in relation to the tax credit system. You could end up just giving a subsidy to the employers who pay very low wages. Thirdly, it needs to be combined with a strengthening and support for collective bargaining rights and trade union rights. And fourthly, and here I'm very indebted to Andrea Fumagalli for this solution to this problem. I've always seen it as a problem that a basic citizen's income means you have to define who the citizens is. And if you have racist immigration policies, then there's a danger that some migrant workers are not classified as citizens and are not entitled to claim the benefit, which of course would create a two-tier workforce. But as Andrea pointed out, you can solve this problem by making it making the entitlement based not on citizenship but on residence. So everybody who is resident gets it. Which so that's in a quick nutshell the issues to do with the tax benefit system. We then obviously need a reform of labour law. The protections that were put in place in the mid-20th century no longer protect, in many countries, any more than a minority of workers. And it seems to me that the ingredients for this, again, I'm talking about the UK context, it might be different elsewhere. First, we need a very clear definition of genuine self-employment. At the moment, the tests for whether or not somebody is self-employed, the legal tests, are very complicated and difficult and hard to establish in law. And we need a really clear definition that works for tax purposes, it works for employment law purposes, and it works, you know, for other purposes as well. And then once you've got a clear definition of self-employed, you can say, well, everybody else is a dependent worker. Everybody who isn't a genuine freelancer, who, for example, you know, sets their own rates of pay and negotiates with clients and has the right to take on assistance, and etc. Excuse me. You say everybody else is a dependent worker, and the onus of proof has to be on the employer to prove that they're not. And then these dependent workers, what we need is, we need a new set of universal rights. We need the existing universal rights that currently are often only available to employees in some countries, like rights to holidays and rights to sick pay and rights to pensions and rights to be represented by a trade union, etc. But we also need some new rights that that relate to the digital era. Workers who are being managed by algorithms or having their data collected by employers who don't know how that data is being used. Some of you might know there's a historic court case going on today between some Uber workers and some Ola workers, taking Uber and Ola to court to get access to the information that drives the algorithms that determine whether they get work or not. Anyway, but the point is, the workers need those kind of rights as well, rights to privacy, and also a right to directly communicate with an employer, not just via an app. So, and finally, oh yes, I'm going back a bit, an enforcement system. It's no use having workers having rights if there's no way to enforce them. And I have, I won't go into it, but I argue for a 3-tier enforcement system in the book, but I suspect we're running out of time, so I'm going to whiz through. This is my last slide, by the way. So my final point is that we need digital technologies for public good. And Sandro talked about this a little bit in the introduction, but I just want to emphasize that this is not a new idea. In the 20th century, when technologies reached a certain critical mass and started achieving monopolistic power, they were decommodified in most countries. Electricity was nationalized, typically. Airlines were nationalized. Telephones systems were nationalized, and so on. There is no reason why, and in fact the Labour Party in the UK last election were arguing that broadband should be nationalized. It seems to me that there are, it's perfectly possible to demand, and indeed we should demand, that some of these digital technologies are treated like 21st century public utilities and brought back under public control and public management. But also, it seems to me that it's very important to develop some local models. In the history of welfare states, prefigurative models have been terribly important. In the 20th century, when Nye Bevan, my compatriot, set up the National Health and designed the National Health Service after World War II, he took his inspiration from a town in South Wales at Tredegar, where the steelworkers and miners in the 19th century had set up a workmen's medical assistance society, which by the end of the 30s, when half of them were unemployed and nobody could afford to put contributions in anymore, was providing health services to 23,000 people in a town that had 24,000 population. They had actually built their own health service, employing their own doctors and nurses and building their own hospital. And this was a really important model for the National Health Service. And I could give other examples, but around the world right now, especially during the pandemic, we are seeing all sorts of really interesting local experiments where people are getting together and using these new technologies, the smartphone technologies and social media and so on, not only just to organize in new ways, but to actually set up services to deliver food to housebound people and so on. And I think it's really important to try and get involved with and experiment with and support prefigurative models however we can. So in summary, what I argue is for a welfare state that's redistributive from the rich to the poor, not the other way around as it is at the moment in the UK, that provides a universal safety net for all citizens, that provides employment rights for all workers, universally provides employment rights, that uses digital technologies to provide social reproductive services to all who need them, and also uses digital technologies for other purposes, basically to develop new kinds of public service for the 21st century. Green transport policies, food distribution policies, waste management policies, etc. Sorry, that's it. End of slideshow. Now I have to work out how to stop screen sharing. Stop share. There we are. Sorry if I've gone on too long, and thanks for listening. I'm available for questions later if you want them.
Now we leave the floor to Professor Standing, and then maybe we can collect questions.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to approach it from a different perspective, but in many respects, I'd like to thank Ursula for her very cogent presentation and congratulate her on the book. I'm beginning with the international context. I've written a little book recently, which was published at the beginning of the pandemic, called Battling 8 Giants. And it takes its theme from William Beveridge's famous report of 1942, in which he made a famous remark on page 2 that it was a time for revolutions, not for patching. What he meant by that is we need a fundamental overhaul, a fundamentally transformed set of social policies for a new era. It was, in a sense, consistent with Karl Polanyi's great transformation. It was a transformational moment. And I believe this is precisely where we are at today. And the theme of that book was, and it goes with a book that I also published last year called Plunder of the Commons, a manifesto for sharing public wealth. The essence of it is that we have moved out of an era of neoliberalism, which was the disembedded phase of the global transformation, into a phase of rentier capitalism. We have a very specific form of capitalism in which this technological revolution that is the basis of platform labor and so on is merely a part of this transformation. And I think it's fundamentally important to put the whole debate about the precariat, about the technological changes and platform capitalism and so on in the context of this global rentier capitalism. What, of course, it means is that more and more of the income and more of the control is going to those who own property, those who own capital. whether it's physical property, financial capital, or intellectual property. And it's in that context that I've argued in this book, and I'm simplifying for I have only a few minutes, that there are 8 modern giants. Beveridge said the challenge of that era was to slay 5 giants. The giants he wanted to kill were disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, bad conditions of living, and want, poverty. I think rentier capitalism has created 8 modern giants which afflict the whole world. It's very interesting that since the pandemic started, I've been asked to give over 50 Zoom presentations, but not just in Europe, certainly not just in Britain, but all over the world. And numerous interviews, and very similar phenomena are taking place in South Africa, in India, in Korea, in Japan, as in large parts of Europe. I do believe this is part of a globalizing labor process, and we cannot really interpret what is happening in one country without interpreting the global labor process as a whole. Of course, it has different outcomes, as Ursula was mentioning it, in different parts of the world, but we cannot divorce the analysis of what's happening in one place from what is happening in other places. And the 8 modern giants, of course, are first of all inequality. We have much greater inequality than at any time in modern history, probably in all history. And a key part for our narrative around the labor issues and around platform issues is that the inequality is reflecting the power of the rentiers. More and more their capacity to exploit, not just in labor, but outside labor. And that, I think, is a very, very key part of the story, because what platform capitalism is about is not just a different form of labor relation, but a process in which more and more people, particularly those in the precariat, are being forced or obliged to do a lot of work for labor, work for the state that is not counted as labor. Andrea Fumagalli, I think he's with us. He and I have often talked about this, and I know that Sandro's work is relating to this as well in the Italian context. And I think that this is an important part of the story, and it's an important part of the fact that inequality reflects this rentier process. And of course, it goes along with financialization. More and more of the income is going to the financial capital. And in Britain, extraordinarily, financial assets today are over 1,000% of GDP. In Italy, they're over 400% of GDP. So what is happening is that the owners of finance and through financialization are exploiting more and more people, and they're doing it outside labor, more and more. They're doing it through forms of debt, through forms of rent. And that is affecting the precariat and all of the situation of the precariat. Leaving aside inequality, which is extreme, of course, alongside that, as a result of rentier capitalism and the neoliberalism deconstruction of the social state in the last 40, 50 years, is a growth of insecurity. And it's not just related to the form of labor relation. It is an insecurity of existential proportions in which the insecurities are wanted by the state. And this chronic insecurity is characterized by uncertainty. It's not the old labor-based contingency risks that Bismarck and Beveridge welfare states were designed to address, contingency risks of being in labor. It was much more about uncertainty, which is unknown unknowns. You can't insure against uncertainty, but that is what the reality of today is about. And millions who are not necessarily in the platform part of the labor process are affected by uncertainty. The third element, the third giant, is that debt has replaced wages. Increasingly, you find in many countries that the so-called jaws of the snake have opened. You see a growth of productivity, but a falling of wages. And that is to do with the rentier character of capitalism today. And that will continue because globalization and the technological changes are making that more and more easy to achieve on behalf of capital. Debt is a mechanism of exploitation because it induces people not just to do more labor, but to do more work for labor. And that is a critical part of the story, because if you leave out that part, you are only talking about one part of the time problem that workers and all of us are facing today. The fourth crisis, the fourth giant, is stress. It is an incredibly stressful system that has evolved, and that stress is causing rising morbidity, rising suicides, rising mistakes, rising precariatized mind phenomena, by which people who are in the lower ends of a labor process are unable to cope and unable to recover from shocks and hazards that they face. The fifth giant is, of course, precarity. And by precarity, I don't mean unstable, insecure labor. I think it's a mistake to use the word precarious work. It's not precarious work. If you're in the precariat, you are facing a life of being a supplicant. Somebody who is in the precariat, if we go back to the Latin derivation of the word precarious, it meant to obtain by prayer, to obtain by having to rely on favors, on discretionary judgments by people in authority, be it a spouse, be it a parent, be a bureaucrat, be a capitalist, be a platform, app, or whatever. You are a supplicant. And the critical part of that, and why I'm emphasizing it very strongly, is that if you were a supplicant, you are losing the rights of citizens. You are a denizen, a term which I very much like. Whether you're a migrant or not, you are losing the rights of citizenship. And that, I think, is a good way of looking at it, because then you focus on the loss of the commons, the loss of civic rights, the loss of cultural rights, the loss of social rights, and the loss of economic rights as a generic trend that you're facing. And the other aspect of precarity is this, that you have to do a lot more work for labor and work for the state. Emphasize that point, and I really want to emphasize that we need to overhaul our labor statistics, overhaul our concepts of work and labor. Because if you just focus on labor time or labor in workplaces, you miss the bigger picture of what is happening to people affected by this process. The sixth giant, of course, is the robots, the approaching AI, and all of this stuff on the platforms. I like to make a distinction between automation and heteromation. Automation is the replacement of labor by machines, and it leads to a particular perspective. I do not believe that it's making everybody redundant. I believe it's increasingly disruptive, and it melds with rentier capitalism. But heteromation is, in addition, the first technological revolution in history, which is leading to pressure to do more work rather than labor. That's never happened before. It is a very distinctive aspect of the technological revolution. The importance of linking the technologies and the precariat phenomena is this, that I think it's important, and I really hope that Ursula can incorporate that into her work, that we need to make a distinction between what I call the concierge part of the platform system, the inducing through the apps. The apps are labor brokers, classic labor brokers. They're the rentiers. They're taking 25%, 50% of every transaction. But the concierge part of the process is literally people doing services. And they may be doing services for people in the precariat as well as others, a point that Ursula was making. But it's a concierge which is lowering the costs of living for those who are the rentiers. The others, not necessarily linked to apps. The second is cloud labor. And here we have Amazon Turk and all the processes of online labor, which is a globalized process. You pick up a service today, you don't get somebody talking to you from Manchester or from Bologna, you get someone talking to you from Goa or Accra. It's a globalized process, or the Philippines quite commonly. And this means that the global labor process is putting huge downward pressure on wages, huge downward pressure on social incomes and bargaining position. Make a fundamentally different type of challenge for people who want to support a redistributive, progressive agenda. And the third thing, of course, is standby labor. This is something like the 0-hour contracts, the people who are just on standby to come in from time to time, or 0 hours through internships and so on. These three categories are different, and we shouldn't put them all in one basket because they have different forms of exploitation, different forms of extraction of rental income, etc. And that leads to the seventh giant. And in my book, I argue that, in fact, this seventh giant is what I believe will tilt the debate on basic income into very favorable territory for us. I've been advocating basic income for over 30 years, and I've always wondered what is going to be the system change that will force a majority to want to support basic income. And this seventh giant, of course, is the threat of extinction. The extinction, we now know through this pandemic, is a threat of extinction not only to nature and the species in nature, but extinction of ourselves, because we have been ecologically disruptive, exploiting nature in an unsustainable, disgusting way, and it's hitting back at us. This is already the sixth pandemic of the 21st century. We are in an era of pandemics. And I believe that the young who are supporting the Extinction Rebellion deserve 100% support. We must join that movement because unless we reverse the ecological crisis, we will not solve any of the other crises. And in that context, we need high carbon taxes. We need high eco taxes. You cannot have a progressive agenda without those things central to the policy structure. And the thing that we've now learned, and Macron learned it in France, Trudeau learned it in Canada, and others are learning it, is that if you have high carbon taxes without recycling the revenue in the form of common dividends, or whatever you want to call them, you will not get the political support to enable it to take place. That is a reason for having basic income. We need carbon taxes, we need commons taxes, as I've argued in the books. But in order to have those, we must guarantee a basic income for people. And a basic income will help reorient our working lives, our control of time, our appreciation of real leisure rather than just recuperative consumption. It will alter and transform the way we want to live. And the eighth giant and the final giant is the threat of neo-fascist populism. We have just fortunately seen a reprieve in the sense that Donald Trump has been jettisoned. It was a close run thing. On page 1 of my book on the precariat, I predicted the emergence of a political monster if the precariat's insecurities were not addressed. In 2016, I received numerous messages from readers around the world saying, "Your monster has arrived." I think we've got lucky this time because he is such a disgusting person, such a narcissistic misogynist, that he was defeatable. But the fact is he got nearly 75 million votes despite everything, and neo-fascist populism is just around the corner. You know Salvini, Britons know Boris Johnson, Hungarians know Orban, etc. And unless we see a political movement that addresses the insecurities and aspirations of the precariat, that neo-fascist populism will become very much closer. I want to end by saying something about basic income. You're listening to a man who's done pilots and been involved in pilots in 4 continents. And the biggest one I've been involved in is in India. I've done it in Africa, in Europe, and in North America. I've also been involved in a small one, which is a 5th continent in Latin America. Everywhere we've seen pilots, with different designs, different levels of income, etc., very similar results have come out. And critical to our debate and the debate around platform labor and platform labor relations is that it enables people to get a greater sense of control of their time. It enables people to lower their stress levels and feel more confident and feel more able to say no to the exploiters, to the oppressors, and through a system. This sense of gaining control is really what this debate should all be about, because it's about freedom, it's about redistribution, and it's about not reinventing something that is dead, that is dying, but transforming into a new convivial society in which we have a different way of living. And that is why I salute the work all of you are doing, because this is unfolding ontological set of issues. We don't know the answers exactly. What we do know is we're at a moment of potential transformation, and that is why all of us should be tolerant to each other in trying to forge a new progressive agenda. I don't think we'll see it with Biden. I don't think we've got there, but we have the potential. And that's what makes it so intellectually exciting. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Guy, thank you, Ursula. for your presentations. And I would leave the floor now for questions. So I invite the participants to raise up the hand or to open the mic to formulate questions. Otherwise, they can also use the chat.
Silence. I've never seen an Italian audience silent.
Nice. And because I have a point that I'd like to highlight, respect to the presentation by Ursula, and I would like to thank her for that. Because I got the opportunity to read part of your book, Reinventing the Welfare State, and when you're talking about basic income, you define it as a redistributive tool or mechanisms. I understand what you're meaning, but I think that this attribute that has to do with redistribution of income needs to be better specified. Because what the platform capitalism is learning to us nowadays is what I can call, in a very approximately way, a becoming up of the life. Because we are inside a valorization mechanisms in which each act of our life is able, in a direct way, more than in an indirect way, produce value and produce wealth. A wealth that is expropriated by the owner of these platforms and by the new business models that lie behind the platform, thanks to the new algorithm technologies. I remember I discussed with Guy about this point about in a conference in Zurich about 5 years or 6 years ago, so some time ago, no? And that is, I think that is an important point, because it means that we have to define basic income as primary income. That is a way to distribute income, not to redistribute income. There is a difference from an economic point of view, from the political point of view, because that means that basic income is justified as a form of remuneration of a productive life, in capitalistic terms, I mean. And a remuneration that today is not certified by the lack of juridical intervention, by the not consideration in collective bargaining dynamics, and of course, in a situation in which precariat is becoming dominant and individual bargaining is hegemonic, this kind of consideration, certifications that life is producing value and should be, then we have to discuss about that, should be remunerated, no, is something that I think that should be more stressed. In order to create an adequate welfare, a reinventing of the welfare, I perfectly agree with all what you said, Ursula, adequate to this kind of transformation, structural transformation, in my opinion, of valorization and accumulation processes of platform capitalism. Platform capitalism is something now that is pervasive. It's not only a single sector. It's something that is pervasive to every sector. And that is a point I would like to stress. I don't want to go on and to use too much time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrea. And maybe now Nelly wanted.
Hi. I have a question for Guy standing. Basically, I was wondering, in your distinction of work and labor, where do you situate reproductive labor. And I find that really interesting also in relation to your analysis of the concierge, as it's quite, I mean, I can think of several gender dimensions in what you described as a concierge. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Do we have other questions?
Maybe I have a question, if I am allowed.
For sure. And then we have also Natalia.
Then first Natalia, because I already spoke.
Hello, thank you for the very, very fascinating discussions. Like, I'm kind of very humble and listen with great attention. So I have one question to Ursula and possibly to Guy. I used to be a lawyer, so I'm kind of like very, very much interested into the regulation of platform economy. And I've heard what Ursula said about that we need to take very, very much into consideration like the particularities of national regulation, because like if we transfer regulation from the one country to the other in terms of like platform economy, it may be a disaster. So I would like here, if it is possible, to talk a bit more the specifics about this. And from the other hand, like I was very much interested into guys like this like global view of introducing like basic income as a global project. So I'm also wondering how can we take into consideration like the particularities, like in how, as we say in feminism, like the feminist standpoints of each country and its particularity in such a huge and global project. So that's my question.
Would you like me to come back on that now?
No, I suppose you gather the questions. Yeah, you gather our questions, so yeah.
So if there are further questions, I won't, but if you'd like me to come back now, I'm happy to do so.
We got Sandro to come first. No?
Yeah, we have.
If there is time.
Yeah, we have half an hour. Yes.
We have time, yeah. So thank you very much for such inspiring talks. I have a comment and a question for Ursula. I perfectly understand your emphasis on the national peculiarity of welfare systems, and in particular on the peculiarity of the UK welfare system that you describe in a very effective way in the book. Nevertheless, I ask myself what do we have beyond the nation? The global processes and challenges we are confronted with today that were described in a very vivid way by Guy are not national processes, are not national challenges. 2 weeks ago, I was invited to a seminar on platformization of labor in Latin America. And it was kind of amazing that the language used in the seminar, the processes described in the seminar were very close to the language we employ, the processes we describe in Europe. This is, in a way, something new. Then, of course, these homogeneous processes translate onto very heterogeneous contexts. And in this moment of translation, very specific and peculiar challenges emerge. Moreover, also looking at the history of welfare systems, I think that the circulation of welfare models and even policies has been very, very important. Just to think of Bismarck's reform of social insurances systems. That reform circulated across Europe and in the United States. And it produced a lot of effects. Again, very heterogeneous effects. And the same is true with the circulation of the New Deal model in the framework of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe after the Second World War. So my question is, how are we able to grasp this moment that I would describe in terms of homogeneity, as I tried to explain. And to conclude, I mean, I was just thinking of the kind of welfare state you presented to us at the end of your talk. A welfare state that is redistributive from employers, the rich to the poor, provides a universal safety net for all citizens, provides employment rights for all workers, etc. Well, this is a kind of model that is valid everywhere, I would say. So my question regards the kind of balance between national peculiarity and transnational kind of dimension. Thank you very much again.
Shall I come back now? Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you for those two questions. I think that were directed specifically at me. I'll leave it for Guy to address the questions addressed to him. Natalia, thank you for your question. This issue of national differences is a really thorny one. I can remember, for instance, in the 1980s when the European Union was, if you like, kind of in formation a little bit, and they were trying to harmonise labour laws as much as they could across Europe. And there was a proposal to introduce temporary employment contracts. That was just a kind of concrete thing. Now, in countries like Germany and Sweden, that was a massive casualisation because they had a labour code and they had national collective agreements that basically said a job is a permanent job. And so there was quite rightly a huge resistance, which they lost basically, but the huge resistance by the trade union movement against the introduction of temporary contracts. Now, in a country like the UK, which has a common law tradition, and the common law tradition, we don't have a labour code. It just says an employer can make any kind of a deal they like with a worker as long as it's not expressly forbidden. And of course, various European directives changed that a lot since the 1980s. But during the 1980s, a temporary contract was a sign of being very, very privileged in the labour market, because basically a worker could be sacked at any point. There were some protections brought in 1976 in the Employment Protection Act, which said if you were a full-time worker and you'd worked continuously for 2 years, you had protection, or if you're a part-time worker and you'd worked for 5 years, you had some protection. But but there was a high turnover in the labour market. So basically any worker with less than 2 years experience could be sacked at any point. So a temporary contract was a wonderful thing to have. a 3-month contract meant you were guaranteed to have a job for at least 3 months. So this is just kind of a small example, but it's one of very many I could quote of a regulation having a completely different impact in a different national legal context from what you would expect. Having said that, there has of course been a huge homogenization. There's been a sort of there's the online platforms that Guy was talking about, platforms like Upwork and so on, are driving a sort of convergence in wages, a global convergence, and they're putting downward pressure on wages in the global north, and actually bringing wages up in parts of the global south in this kind of huge convergence. And so what we have is this huge dilemma, which I think has historically always been a dilemma for Labour, of how you balance the sort of international solidarity and campaigning for international standards on the one hand, with you know, working from the bottom up in local communities and protecting living conditions where unions are strong in the local level. So this is a dilemma for the trade union movement. It's also a huge dilemma for national governments. As we see, I mean, Brexit is a classic example of, you know, a government getting it terribly wrong. At the moment, we have neoliberalism has brought in this sort of a global structure in which there is actually a kind of a vacuum above the national level. In the early 20th century, indeed the late 19th century, it was possible for nation states to bring in laws that actually disciplined capitalists and how they behaved on their terrain. I mean, to varying degrees, it depended on the nation. But you could extract, countries could extract taxes from capitalists. They could control monopolies. They had antitrust laws, for instance, in the United States. And these are gone now. Capital can flit from country to country. They can avoid paying taxes in any given country. They can, monopolies can grow at a global level with very little to stop them. So we have this huge, as I said, a vacuum at the international level. And it's clearly a political space that it's important to fill. And I would argue that, you know, bodies like the European Union are very important, so to speak, battlegrounds in which demands can be raised that attempt to bring global capitalists under control. And national states increasingly have very little power to do something about it. However, we all live somewhere. We all inhabit a particular patch of earth, and there are, and it's very often local policies that shape our everyday living conditions, particularly the social reproduction, and particularly labour. And this is why demands for things like a minimum wage actually become very important, because even if you can't make the global platform pay its taxes in your country, even if you can't stop them taking a 25% cut from the value of each transaction and hoovering it out of the national economy to accrue in California or somewhere, at least the higher the wages, the more money sticks in the pockets of local workers. So we have to always look, on the one hand, at demands that strengthen local collectivities and what can be achieved locally, while also keeping an eye on the ball of what's going on globally. And this is a huge challenge, Sandro, you've just put your finger on what faces us. And I just think at the moment, politically, the most important thing is to hang on to our optimism. And this is another reason why I think local prefigurative models are so important, because they give people hope. When you achieve something, when you win something, it kind of gives you hope to believe that you can win something else. It keeps the social fabric going. Right, sorry, I'll stop there.
Shall I respond? Shall I respond?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent questions. First of all, Andrea, he put it very well, because exactly how I feel that it's important not to treat basic income as an alternative just to different Beveridge Bismarck type welfare policies. It's more than that. It's about establishing a base for a new income distribution system, because the 20th century income distribution system of industrial capitalism has broken down and it won't come back. And we need to realize that the public wealth, the commons, we have to realize, and I know this is a phrase that Andrea and I share, we have to move to a system of common fare, not welfare. And common fare means saying that we as commoners, all of us as commoners, have a right to the commons. And the commons belong to all of us equally. And therefore we must gain the rental income taken by the plunderers of the commons, the civil commons, the social commons, the natural commons, the cultural commons, the educational commons, and most of all the intellectual commons. We must get back the rental income that the owners of those properties now are taking from us, and use that as the basis of a new system in which we build up a commons fund, a commons capital fund, from which, as it's built, we pay out commons dividends or basic income. I don't like the term universal basic income, as I've argued many times in the books, because in practical, pragmatic terms, we don't mean universal. I've argued in the books that it's not just residence. We have to be talking about usual residence. I might be a temporary resident, but I wouldn't be entitled to the basic income of Italy. But if I was a usual resident, then I would be entitled to a basic income if it existed as a system in Italy. And I think it's important for that, because commonly people say it would entice migrants to come into Italy or Britain or wherever. And we would say, no, pragmatically, migrants, if legally recognized as migrants, and they should be, would have to have a waiting period. That doesn't mean we would say you can't have any support during that period. You should have support. It should be outside the basic income as a system. Of course, you wouldn't pay Italians or Britons who were living outside Italy or the UK their basic income, because they wouldn't be usual residents. As far as Nelly's point, I think a very good point, because the real appeal of basic income is that it would treat all forms of work with equal respect, and with the claim that every form of work should have the same dignity, the same social protection, the same voice, the same sense of agency. And reproductive work, I would prefer, because it's not paid labor, there's no exchange value, it is the work we do to reproduce ourselves, and if we're fortunate, reproduce our loved ones. We have learned in this pandemic, I hope, beyond any retreat, that care work is the most valuable work of all. And it doesn't just mean looking after babies or looking after elderly parents or whatever, although those things are important, but the sense of care of ourselves and our community and our reproduction, not just in a physical sense, but in the reproduction of ourselves as human beings with agency and freedom in society. And that means decommodifying education. The worst feature of the neoliberal agenda has been the commodification of education. The worst feature, because it breeds neo-fascist populism, as well as a loss of respect for reproductive activities. So for me, it's very important. I have good news for you, Nelly, that in every pilot I have been involved in, women have benefited more than men. And I like that, because that is what it should be. And at the same time, men benefit, but women feel a sense of emancipation. They feel that the emancipatory value of the basic income is greater than the monetary value. It enhances their ability to say no. We have seen huge growth of domestic violence during this pandemic. Women who've had a basic income have sometimes moved out of abusive relationships because they have financial security, even if modest. That's an important freedom. And we're learning to respect that. We shouldn't be learning it now, of course not, but the state is learning that. Sandro's points, I totally agree. And I was listening to him making the comments, and I thought of a PhD dissertation that I examined, and I was moved to tears because it was by a Chinese woman who had done her PhD using my concepts in the precariat about the growth of the Chinese precariat. And as Sandra was talking, it reminded me of a key theme in her dissertation. It's a wonderful dissertation. A key theme was that the precariat in China are using apps, are using digital technology as a subversive tool, as a mechanism of sabotage, as a mechanism of social solidarity in ways that would not have been imagined 10, 15 years ago. They are using these technologies as a modern form of Luddism, a modern form of resisting the new forms of exploitation that are being introduced without any quid pro quos. Memes, very nice, very, very subversive. And I think that that is something that we should be thinking about as a underside of the growth of platform capitalism. As far as Natalia's points, as a lawyer, I hope you think about the very important parts of platform capitalism and the growth of the precariat. I wrote a book called A Precariat Charter. And I thought, what would be the policies that the precariat would support today that would be different from what a proletariat charter would have looked like 100 years ago? And halfway through doing it, I realized that one of the most important principles is the loss of due process, the loss of the civic commons. People in the precariat and people in platform capitalist relations lose due process. The abuses can go outside labor law, outside common law, outside the legal system, and need to be addressed in a different way. Due process is a very important thing. And in that, think about this. It's increasingly important to be regulating work off workplaces, work outside labor. We have labor laws, but they don't address what is actually the new forms of exploitation taking place. We need to put much more emphasis on that. Diana's point in the chat, I will end on. I hope we can mobilize huge public support for basic income as a response to the pandemic. We will not have social resilience unless the resilience of the weakest members of our societies are strengthened. I have news. Beginning of this month, an opinion poll was conducted in 6 member countries of the European Union. In France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Poland, and Spain. And in every country today, this is the first week of December 2020, big majorities express support for basic income. We've not had that before. Over 70% of Italians responding to this opinion poll supported basic income. And when asked what it would mean to them personally, the answers were very interesting because, contrary to the prejudice of critics, it shows that many people would want to increase the control they have of their time and would want to be using it to enable themselves to develop new forms of interaction in society. I think this has a powerful message for the project that PLUS is embarking on, and I hope that many of you can look at the results of those surveys. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ursula. Thanks a lot, Guy. So it's 37. We are close to the conclusion. I just ask to participants if there is someone else who wants to make a short question.
I've just noticed there are some questions coming up in the comments. Do you want us to address some of those? They're mainly actually comments rather than questions.
Yeah, yeah.
So the discussion is going on in the chat regarding, you know,
It's difficult to do two things at once. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. There's clearly a lot of interest in universal basic income in Europe, but there's also a lot of interest in the issue that Nelly was raising about work and labour, and of course that's always a very key component of my analysis, is the way in which the technological change under capitalism transforms unpaid work into paid work and creates the household as a new arena for accumulation. And this is very precisely the area which is targeted by a lot of the online platforms. The slide I showed earlier looked at just household labour, things like cleaning and so on. But it's clearly very evident that platforms like Deliveroo, for instance, are providing what used to be a household service that was either provided, carried out free or in the informal economy. In fact, it's a sort of, it's almost like the classic example of how online platforms are driving new forms of consumption and new forms of consumption work and new areas of capitalist accumulation in the home. You know, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person in this conversation who uses Deliveroo when I'm just too exhausted to cook, you know. In the days before lockdown, you would sit on the bus and you'd think, oh, can I face going to the supermarket and getting the stuff and taking it home and cooking it? Or can I just, and there you are, you've got an app on your phone and you can just order the food there and then to be ready when you come home. And the same applies for so many of these platforms. But they have a functionality that could give us such wonderful public services. I really do urge people to use their imaginations. They, what we used to call meals on wheels for elderly people. You know, a horrible meal would come around at a time that nobody wanted, consisting of food that nobody wanted. The idea of using a Deliveroo type platform, a public platform, to bring nice food to people when they want it, sick people who need it, and but under conditions where the workers have decent work, and local food suppliers can feed into the service so that you can get local food produced by ethically by local farmers, distributed in cities in a do you know what I mean? There are so many possibilities. So if I just want to end on an optimistic note, please work in your local communities to find good ways to develop alternative local platforms, because I think this could be a really great form of decommodification for the 21st century.
While we are talking, discussion is going on in the chat. I just wanted to mention a question. Maybe we can conclude with this, with Diana asking if the term universal basic income and unconditional basic income are used interchangeably or not.
Shall I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Sometimes people do use those terms, but they don't mean the same thing. As I said, we don't actually mean universal, we mean quasi-universal. And we don't, when people use the term unconditional, they don't actually mean unconditional either. It's quasi-unconditional. You have to be a usual resident. That's a condition. That's a condition. You have to be over a certain age. That's a condition. But there are no behavioral conditions in a basic income, or as few as possible. And I think that's the important principle. But it also, it's got to be understood that it is an individual basic income. It's something paid individually. And actually that is not making it individualistic. It makes it that it's a mechanism of equality of status. And I think that is equally important as any other aspect of basic income. Unlike the old welfare state, which was breadwinner models giving to a household, which is an endogenous concept, not an exogenous concept. And I think that is a fundamental difference between a basic income-based system and a Beveridge or Bismarck welfare system.
Thank you, Guy. And we are pretty close to 7. I would close the seminar. I thanks again Professor Standing and Professor Huws for participating. I thanks Professor Mezzadra for introducing the discussion. It was a pleasure to share with you these reflections that for sure will inspire our work on welfare in the project that we are going to start in very few. And we hope to have other possibilities to update this discussion with some results from our research in next month. So thanks again, and have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Thank you.
to Sandro for hosting it, arranging it all. Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, Ursula. Thank you, Guy. It was, I think, a great discussion. And see you soon again.
Good.
Possibly not on screen.
Yeah.
Let's hope.
In Bologna. In Bologna.
In Bologna, we'll invite you. Definitely.
Good.
Ciao. Ciao.
E mo stop.
Ti arriva via mail, no? La registrazione?
Mm?
Ti arriva via mail.